This episode, we inch closer and closer to the end of 1988. We've now reached December. So what's in this episode? How about the massive, enormous Crontendo 1988 computer game roundup? Our quick run through the highlights of the year in computer gaming. Besides that, we have, drumroll please, Japanese adventure games, military strategy games, board games, the usual stuff, and an action classic from Tecmo. So let's get started. Alright folks, let's make this one brief. Family Mahjong 2. Oh my goodness, another Mahjong game? What a surprise. Namco's original Family Mahjong came out back in August '87. This one has some fancy new options. I actually like the neon option menu. There's a regular old play a game of Mahjong option, as well as Mahjong Tournament and now Mahjong Grand Prix. You have options to turn on or off the various rules in the game, and you can also turn off the background music. So this looks just like every other Mahjong game we've ever seen. I'll point out this is a one-on-one version of Mahjong, as opposed to the standard 4-player Mahjong. It appears this game was developed by Nihon Busan, aka Nichibutsu. They were actually well known for making a lot of Mahjong arcade games at this point. The Grand Prix mode has you face off against a series of opponents. You actually have stats in this mode, for example luck, stamina, and there's a menu to buy or sell. So the influence of RPGs has even crept into Mahjong games at this point. Naturally they find room to squeeze in some cheerleaders here. We've seen quite a few of Namco's family sports games so far, but the series seems to be petering out for the time being. You might be happy to know that there is not going to be a Family Mahjong 3. Alright, it's the first FDS game this episode, and this is one of those games where the very first thing you see is the instructions to flip the disc. So, the device that gave us Zelda and Metroid and Castlevania now gives us Jomon Tentaiden Marengumi from Bandai, aka the sequel to Omo Ikiri Tentaiden Harogumi, which we saw back in episode 29. Wait a second, you say, I can't remember Omo Ikiri Tentaiden Harogumi. Well, it was based on an 80s Toei TV show, and was from the mind of Shotaro Ishinomori, who is basically like the Japanese Sid and Marty Krofft. The show involves a bunch of kids running around trying to catch some sort of mysterious masked master thief. And Jesus, where are these kids' parents? Hey mom, I want to go out and find this guy who runs around town wearing a gold mask and a cape. Okay sonny, be back by dinner time. That's like letting your kids spend the night at Michael Jackson's house. So after a few minutes of loading screens and menus, the game starts. And it turns out to be one of these games. This sort of top-down adventure game, where you run around town interacting with NPCs using various objects. You have a little command menu, and you get some special items to use. You know, I give a lot of shit to Japanese adventure games in the Portopia mode, but there was also this subgenre, the top-down adventure game. We've seen a few of these, like Kira Princess from Imagineer back in 1986, which looks just like this game. Or there was Sunsoft's Mido Koman series, which have a bit more action in them. Or Kion Shizu 2, that Chinese vampire game. These are all titles which are sort of like adventure games, only in the top-down format. Generally, you spend a lot of time running around town talking to people. It's kind of like those fetch quests and RPGs that takes place entirely inside a village. You have to run around and like get an item and give it to someone else. It's like a whole game of that. In this game you can switch between various team members, all of which have different inventories. I don't really know what all these items do, but it doesn't look real exciting. The fact that this game seems almost completely forgotten in Japan, so it must be pretty obscure. I don't know if there's anything about this game that recommends pursuing it any further. I'm really sorry folks, but the worthless crap is just not going to stop this episode. For example, Chugoku Sensei Jutsu, a weird little title from Jaleco, apparently developed by ACOM, but Sanritsu's name is also in there. So what exactly is Chugoku Sensei Jutsu? Why, it's Chinese astrology. So this is not a game, but rather sort of a fortune-telling simulation. So this wise old guy with the gigantic eyebrows is going to tell you your fortune. You start by entering your name and date of birth, and the game can take up to 10 different individuals' information. Once you've done that, the cartridge will peer into your future and give you some valuable info. For entertainment purposes, this is done using little cutscenes and whatnot. So let's take a look at marriage. I'm going to guess this is not good. I'd be concerned, but I didn't actually enter in my real birth date. So this is apparently someone else's fortune. And this is your fortune for professional prospects. All kinds of interesting stuff can be learned here, like your lucky numbers, lucky foods. Maybe you remember a similar NES game called Taboo, designed by Rare. This is sort of the same idea. Putting this in video game form seems sort of unnecessary, but I guess if you want to get your fortune read and you don't want to read it out of a boring old book or something, pop in this cart instead. Now here's an oddity that you might be interested in. Kai Takeda Mario Bros., or The Return of Mario Bros., a somewhat rare and very strange variation on Mario Bros. Released on the Famicom Disk System Writer. Note the copyright to Nagatanian. Who are they? Well, this cutscene might just explain a few things. Yep, it's an ad for Nagatanian fried rice seasoning. And after this, you get to play good old-fashioned Mario Bros., a game we covered way back in Grantendo Episode 1. For those with bad memories, that was the port of the arcade game, which was the Mario game that appeared in between Donkey Kong Jr. and Super Mario Bros. So why was this particular variation made? I don't know. Nintendo and Nagatanian had been doing various promotions together for a while. Check out this ad for Nagatanian's Mario and Princess Peach branded telephone cards and seasonings. This cutscene seems to be promoting the Ochazuki Nori rice soup seasoning. That was their flagship product, I suppose. Now the thing was, there have actually been some subtle changes made to the game. Mario himself handles differently, his jumps are sort of more in the modern Super Mario Bros. Fashion, and the turtle sprites have also been changed. The original NES Mario Bros. Had these oddly shaped turtles. One brand new thing is this weird little minigame using a slot machine. You can play this to win extra lives. What? Was that the Final Fantasy music? Obviously, this was never released outside of Japan, but a game called Mario Bros. Classic was released in Europe. That was based off this version, not the older Mario Bros. That came out in Japan and the US. Though of course it was missing all the cutscenes. So anyway, this is officially the strangest Mario game yet. And it's Anticipation. Yep, here's an undated US-only game from November 1988. Is this aimed at adults? I mean, look at the imagery. Red kissy lips, the kind of shoes that are normally referred to as fuck-me heels, a phallic-looking trumpet, and a rather suggestively spilled ice cream cone. Throw in a classy black, white, and gray logo, and you have what appears to be sort of a naughty game for grown-ups. However, this game was designed by Rare, and Rare has never had a problem with having a big gap between appearances and reality. Just check out any of the titles and covers to any other old computer games and you'll see what I mean. They are masters of misdirection. Anticipation is like a Western-only release from Nintendo designed for the US market, and it's a board video game, but not anything like all those Japanese Game of Lifestyle games. No, it's more like a Pictionary type game. There is a board, and most of the action takes place on the draw screens, where the computer starts drawing something and you need to guess what it is. Using a setup suspiciously familiar to Wheel of Fortune and Jeopardy, use the D-pad to spell out the word, and if you get it right, you'll move forward on the board the number of spaces shown on the die. Now, the idea of trying to guess what the computer is drawing it's an interesting idea, but it doesn't really work perfectly in practice. What's this, for example? A carpenter ant? Some sort of beetle? Computer knows. Oh, I see, it's a Space Invader. Of course, anyone could have guessed that. The first player to get the answer right will get the color of the square that was landed on. Whoever gets all 4 colors moves up a level. So much like the enormously popular Trivial Pursuit game, the object is not really to get ahead of the other players on the board, it's to land on the right colors and get the answers correct. Anticipation is basically Trivial Pursuit crossed with Pictionary. On level 2 the puzzles are a little bit different. They don't show the dots, nor the number of letters in the word, making it trickier, for human players at least, but not for the CPU. What the heck is this going to be? Who knows? But the CPU recognized it as a fire extinguisher, something no human could guess based on what was drawn. Of course, the answer was actually extinguisher. If you tried typing in fire extinguisher, you would have been wrong. And what are these? Well, quotation marks obviously. But when you get to the A, well, no, that's wrong, so I guess they're just quotes. And why is this in the office category anyway? And here's another example of a CPU opponent having psychic powers. What? Oh, it somehow figures out that was a cassette tape? Naturally, Anticipation can be played for up to 4 human players, but similar problems will arise. There's a limited number of pictures, in fact several repeated during the one game I played, so someone who's played it before is going to have a very distinct advantage over someone playing it for the first time. If I play this again and the cassette came up, I'd be able to guess it well before anyone else. Eventually you'll reach the final level and collect all 4 colors, and then you win. And then your avatar ascends up into heaven and encounters a grisly winner's trophy featuring the corpses of your opponents. Actually, no, I guess that's not what it is because you're on the trophy too. It's just a weird trophy. And then the screen will freeze and you stay here forever. Nothing ever else happens after you win. So we do see a certain consistency in Rare's work. The board is presented in Rare's beloved isometric perspective, and Anticipation greatly resembles the releases for GameTek. And I hope you like Rare because they're going to be responsible for like literally every other US-only game released in 1989. Designing games for Nintendo, Acclaim, GameTek, LJN. American NES games will be dominated by Rare in '89. December 1988 at last, and our first game is Alien Syndrome. Pretty cool action-packed opening here. That's a pretty scary looking alien. And yep, it's another Sega game published for the Famicom by Sunsoft, just like Fantasy Zone, which we saw a while back. I don't know how or why Sega is licensing its games to Sunsoft for release on the Famicom. Maybe they want to piss off Nintendo? In 1989, Sega allowed Tengen to publish the game in the US as an unlicensed cartridge, so yeah, maybe so. Anyway, Alien Syndrome is a top-down action game, sort of in the run-and-gun style. It's pretty typical for the time. The object is to find all the hostages on a level and then get to the exit. Originally, Sega released Alien Syndrome in arcades in 1987. Not a bad little game, but hardly Sega's most memorable original title, and it was certainly looked kind of low-tech compared to some of the other stuff Sega was releasing in '87. And we've already seen the Master System version of Alien Syndrome, published by Sega themselves. The game was changed quite a bit. It now used Zelda-style flip screens, and aliens just sort of materialized out of nowhere when you enter a room. This was pretty annoying, because they would often appear right where you were standing. In comparison, Sunsoft's Famicom version was much more successful at recreating the original. The flip screens were gone, and the game now smoothly scrolls as you move around on a level. And also, the aliens on the first level now match the arcade's original. They're those weird little blob things. You can find a number of weapons and cubby holes in each level, such as a pretty decent flamethrower. And once you've rescued all the comrades on a level, it's time to go to the exit. If you make it to the exit before the timer runs out, you'll fight a boss, who, incidentally, also has a timer. Bosses are all of the sort of shoot the weak spot that occasionally appears variety. And they all have like a weird design, like what's this guy supposed to be exactly? Afterwards his head will detach and fly around. Everything in the game seemed to sort of inspired or ripped off from Ridley Scott's Alien movie. This is true not only in the enemies' appearances, but more explicitly so in some of the cover art for different versions of this game. Now the second level brings on the enemies that look just like the Xenomorph from the movies, and the fact that they sort of walk around with their wagging their little tails makes them seem kind of like cute little puppy dogs, so it sort of detracts from their fearsomeness. You can find a few different weapons throughout this game, the laser, the flamethrower, there's like a grenade launcher, something like that. Nothing too exciting though. And the fact that each level is just sort of the same idea, basically just running around a maze-like series of rooms, makes the game sort of repetitive. On the positive side, there's the rather ominous, creepy music, which gives the game sort of a nerve-wracking atmosphere. And the fact that there's like the sheer number of aliens is sort of overwhelming. It almost makes it like an early survival horror game. You don't have limited ammo, but the screen can very quickly fill up with respawning enemies. So you often have to like sort of run around the aliens, you can't really shoot them all. So Alien Syndrome is sort of like Dead Space Zero. It's not a bad game, it's certainly better than the Master System version, amazingly enough as that is, but still it's a decent port of a so-so arcade game, and really Alien Syndrome is not too memorable. Here we have a new one from Vic Tokai, the oddly named Totsuzen Macho Man, a game that revolves around you transforming from a little runt into an enormous, nearly nude bodybuilder. Welcome to Crazy Island. This actually got a US release by Sammy under the name Amagon. Man, I sure dig that logo, with the eyes and fangs on the O. Not sure why Amagon was flying a Red Baron-style biplane or wearing an early 20th century bathing suit. The island is not crazy in the US version, so the goal is to get to that boat. And look, there it is in the background. Doesn't even look that far away. Swimming might make more sense than crossing the island. So this is another Japanese game, so normally harmless creatures will kill you with one touch. Birds, spiders, mushrooms, mosquitoes, frogs, all are extremely dangerous here. I don't know what the Japanese game's plot is, but according to the US release's manual, Amagon is the world's most decorated marine, which seems unlikely considering his fragility. And the box art depicts him as some goofy-looking kid. He even looks too young to be handling that rifle. And what the hell sort of name is Amagon anyway? Marines in video games have names like Bill or Lance or something like that. Were his parents hippies or Lord of the Rings fans or something? The object, aside from shooting everything and not getting killed, is to grab those power-ups that add to your points. Get enough points and you'll be able to turn into Megagon, a more macho version of Amagon. However, you need to also find the Mega Key, which has a little graphic of Megagon on it. Of course, there's only one or two specific enemies in a level that actually drop the Mega Key. And if you don't find it, you'll be kind of screwed when you reach the boss. Hitting select will transform you into Megagon if possible. The little bars at the top center will show you your life. Each time you take a hit, it'll take off one bar. You also have a cool wave beam, but it uses up, again, 1 bar each time you fire it. When all your bars are gone, you transform back. The bosses are easy as Megagon, but take tons of hits while you're in regular form. Oh yeah, and did I mention your ammo is limited, and if you run out, you're screwed? Now I like Amagon's bright cartoony graphics, and the game looks pretty simple. One thing that's not obvious watching Amagon be played by someone else is just how brutally hard it is. There's usually not a lot of enemies on screen at once, but they tend to lay traps for you. The wasps, for example, will fire projectiles at you, and you can't really jump over or through them. If one fires its projectiles right in front of you, you're pretty much dead. And the game loves having enemies rush towards you very quickly. Like here, the spider just zooms towards you. Or here, the snake shoots projectiles right when you kill them sometimes, and they're just too fast to avoid. But perhaps the worst are the birds. They tend to fly across the screen incredibly fast right as you're jumping, and you can't control yourself in mid-jump. So often you'll jump and then blam, a bird immediately smacks right into you mid-jump. And this seems kind of like a memorization-based game, but the exact timing and number and position of certain enemies seems kind of random. So you can't just memorize specifically when to jump. And these kinds of sudden deaths occur over and over again. It's infuriating. Right now I'm also playing Ninja Gaiden for this episode, and let me tell you, the first half of Ninja Gaiden is a piece of cake compared to the first part of Amagon. Sure, Ninja Gaiden has numerous respawning enemies and flying enemies and that sort of thing, but they just don't move this fast. It's like ghosts and goblins, only the enemies can zoom across the screen in a split second. I mean, look at this, how could I possibly have avoided that bird? So the constant cheap deaths, the limited ammo, and the fact that the bosses are pretty much impossible if you're not in Megagon form, make Amagon not very well remembered today. Most people seem to dislike it, though it does have a few defenders. The original version seems to be an early example of the Japanese fixation on campy bodybuilder games. Other examples being, of course, the Cho Anki games, or the WiiWare title Muscle March. The US version gives no explanation whatsoever about how or why Amagon turns into Megagon. I can't say Amagon is good, but it has potential, but the way it alternates between sort of dull, unchallenging areas and repeated instant deaths make Amagon not very fun. "1988 is almost over, but one more thing we've got to get out of the way is the 1988 Computer Game Roundup. Just like we did back in '87, we're going to take a whirlwind tour of the computer game scene in 1988, covering the best or biggest or most interesting games or the most representative games of that year. Obviously we can't come close to mentioning every great game, so if your all-time favorite 1988 computer game is not here, sorry. A bit of background for you younger folks. In the mid-'80s, the computer market was divided up among several types of machines, all of which were completely incompatible with each other. Now the old guard by this time was on its way out. The Apple II was a decade old by this point, and the enormously popular Commodore 64 was also pretty ancient. Games still came out for these things, but they were virtually obsolete by 1988. Newer high-tech machines were available for those with deep pockets, such as the Commodore Amiga, and the suspiciously similar Atari ST, which was released after Jack Tramiel, formerly of Commodore, bought Atari Corporation. There was also Apple's Macintosh with its futuristic graphic interface, but at this time the Mac was merely an ugly-looking toy for the rich, rather than the computing behemoth that it is today. Across the ocean, they were still stuck with the likes of the ZX Spectrum and the Amstrad, extremely affordable and popular machines that made the Commodore 64 look high-tech by comparison. But by 1988, it was clear that a winner had emerged in the home computer wars, the x86-based IBM clone, generally running DOS. The fancy new VGA graphics standard had recently been introduced, so we'll see a pretty big jump in the graphic capabilities in 1988. A number of changes are going to be in store for computer games in the next few years, but let's start by looking on some of the older genres, adventure games and strategy games. For the last couple of years, the graphical adventure game had been dominated by Sierra. This was still true in 1988, but changes were afoot. Gold Rush, designed by Ken and Doug McNeil, who had also worked on the King's Quest games, was one of the very last games using the old AGI engine. It's not really that different than from King's Quest in the way that it looks or plays. It's sort of like King's Quest set during the 1949 Gold Rush. For whatever reason, Gold Rush is almost completely forgotten today. Sierra's big game of the year was probably King's Quest IV, the latest in their flagship series, and it introduced Sierra's new game engine, SCI, aka Sierra's Creative Interpreter. This meant higher resolution graphics, better sound, and mouse support. King's Quest IV is a bit of a departure in terms of your character. You now play Rosella, King Graham's daughter, but the game plays basically the same, including, of course, lots of opportunities for death or unwinnable games. And once again, the game relies heavily on European fairy tales for its subject matter. Another, very different sequel was Al Lowe's Leisure Suit Larry Goes Looking for Love in Several Wrong Places. It was a step up technologically from the first game. Once again single, Larry roams around Los Angeles, and later ends up on a cruise ship. The sexual humor seems toned down quite a bit. There's no hookers biting off your penis in this one, and the game's cruelty has perhaps been dialed down a bit as well, and there are far fewer sudden deaths. Completely different from the typical Sierra game was Manhunter New York, produced by the three Murray brothers. Sets of brothers seem pretty common at Sierra. This bizarre dystopian sci-fi adventure game was unusual in that it used a point-and-click style system rather than text input. It also dumped the typical flip screens for an overworld map. The game is set in a pretty accurate version of New York. It's a bit of an overlooked gem, though it does have the typical Sierra awkward action sequences and surprise deaths. Like here, don't look at his face. Oh, good lord. No idea what that means. On the flip side, Lucasfilm Games, as LucasArts was called back then, released its follow-up to Maniac Mansion, Zach McCracken and the Alien Mindbenders. It's very similar to Mansion, right down to the cutscenes, and even the casual animal cruelty. You can put your pet goldfish in the garbage disposal if you wish. Though, rather than taking place at just one location, you zip around the world via commercial jet airliners. Money is also brought into play as you need to buy airline tickets and various items. As in Maniac Mansion, you switch between characters at certain points, but unlike that game, there aren't multiple solutions based on which character you're playing, so it's sort of a step back in a way. But Sierra and Lucasfilms weren't the only folks making graphical adventure games. Lots of companies were, including some new faces, such as Jam Software and their game Dream Zone. Damn, those are some ugly digitized graphics. But did you notice the names on the title screen? Andy Gavin and Jason Rubin. Yep, Jam Software would soon change their name to Naughty Dog, and eventually find fame and fortune with Crash Bandicoot, Jax and Daxter, and Uncharted. This is a rather unauspicious beginning. Likewise, The Manhole was the first game from Cyan and Rand and Robin Miller. Originally released for the Macintosh and created using HyperCard, Manhole was a surreal adventure game aimed at kids. This is the Amiga version, by the way. Later, the Millers would release another HyperCard game for the Mac called Myst, which would go on to be one of the biggest selling computer games ever. And playing Manhole, it almost feels kind of like a goofy prototype for Myst. Now, by this time, graphical and point-and-click adventure games had squeezed out the older-style text adventure games, sometimes known as interactive fiction. To see how the once mighty had fallen, look no further than Zork Zero, one of the very last games from Infocom, which had been releasing huge sellers like Zork and Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy in the first half of the 1980s. By 1988 they had been acquired by Activision, and Infocom was finally shuttered in 1989, though Activision continued to use the name from time to time. Aside from adventure games, the other predominant genre in the early days of computer games was the strategy game, specifically the military strategy game. And in '88, these old-fashioned hex games were still around. One major title was Decisive Battles of the American Civil War Volume 1 from SSG, who are still around today making military strategy games. While most of these things have been completely forgotten today, look through old issues of Computer Gaming World and you'll be amazed at how popular they once were. Still, more modern variations were springing up all the time. For example, Red Storm Rising, based on the Tom Clancy novel. It seems like pretty much every Tom Clancy novel has been turned into a video game at some point. Unlike the games made by SSG, Red Storm Rising has an involved plot, slick interfaces, fancy graphics, cutscenes, all the sorts of cutting-edge stuff you would expect in early 1988. Of course, not all strategy games were military-themed. Nope, take SSI's President-Elect 1988 edition, an update of an old Apple II game. The interfaces and graphics are pretty minimal, but I realize now that United States presidential election game, that one we saw in Crontendo episode 37, was very much in the style of this. Though naturally being a computer game, just about everything about your candidate or election is customizable, and you can select to play an election from any number of years. But still, it's not exactly much to look at. Which is definitely not the case for this game, Hidden Agenda from Transfiction, another game originally created for the Mac using HyperCard. Hidden Agenda is a Central American government simulation game. This is the DOS version, but you can definitely see its Macintosh origins with the crisp black and white graphics. You play as your country's new president, do things like pick a cabinet, set policy, engage in diplomacy. It's definitely a unique game for its time, and its style and easy-to-use interface make it reasonably playable today. Moving in another direction, we have the stupidly named Laser Squad, a turn-based action strategy game with a sci-fi theme, developed by Target Games and published by Blade Software, originally for the ZX Spectrum. This is the Commodore 64 version, though far prettier versions came out for DOS and the Amiga later. You select a squadron of soldiers to infiltrate a series of buildings occupied by enemy forces. If this greatly resembles XCOM UFO Defense, that's because it was designed by the same people. Laser Squad is basically XCOM 0. Much like military simulation games, flight simulators have sort of fallen out of favor in recent years, but they were quite popular in the 80s. And here's a big one, Battlehawks 1942, a very technical, historically accurate game, and the first flight simulation game from Lucasfilm. Battlehawks spawned two popular sequels, Their Finest Hour and Secret Weapons of the Luftwaffe. The game was designed by a fellow named Lawrence Holland, who later went on to create a little game you might have heard of called X-Wing. Yep, this right here is the humble beginning of the LucasArts flight simulation empire. Throughout the 80s, PC games faced competition from two sources, arcade games and console games. This was certainly true in 1988, so action-based games formed a big chunk of game publishers' catalogs. Confusingly referred to as arcade games at the time, many of these play like Nintendo games but with worse controls. 1984's Impossible Mission was a huge hit, so naturally Epyx released a sequel. This is the Amiga version. You run around a series of buildings, looking through computers and various objects for passwords and avoiding the killer robots. You also try to avoid falling to your death, which is not always easy because of your weird and awkward jump. This actually sort of resembles the Master System game Zillion. Oddly, the success of this and their other games didn't prevent Epyx from declaring bankruptcy in 1989. Now compare Impossible Mission 2's ugly graphics to those of Obliterator, and you'll see why Psygnosis was so legendary at the time. We have a typically beautiful looking intro here, and great music from David Whittaker. Now, do you remember another Psygnosis game from the 1987 Computer Game Roundup called Barbarian? This is basically Barbarian in space. It's designed by the same guys who did Barbarian, and has the same god-awful control scheme where you use the mouse to press buttons along the bottom of the screen. This is actually sort of a common problem with Psygnosis. Their games look great, but are a pain to play. 180 degrees in the other direction, we have Exile, which is a pretty unimpressive looking game that uses a sophisticated physics engine and a huge open-ended world. It sort of resembles a computer version of Metroid crossed with the old Famicom game Astro Robo-Sassa, which had sort of a similar usage of momentum and gravity. Originally designed for the obscure British computer, the Acorn Electron, this is the Commodore 64 version, and is a classic example of the sort of British technical ingenuity overcoming a system's limitations. Speaking of British game designers, they were still putting out these isometric platformers in 1988. This one is called Inside Outing, or The Adventures of Devon Air, designed by a little company called Softtech and published by Epyx in the United States. This one looks pretty nice, and the Commodore version has decent music. I guess Sabrewulf and all those other games just made an indelible mark in the UK game industry. Shoot-'em-ups were obviously pretty big in arcades at the time, so naturally computers had them as well. Mostly terrible ones. This one was pretty popular, Armalite, aka Delta 2. This is obviously a Gradius ripoff, and seems barely playable today, but yet it got really good reviews when it came out. At least it has the typical funky C64 music. Much prettier is Menace, again published by Psygnosis, but developed by DMA Design. That's right, the famous Scottish developer named after a psychedelic drug. I believe this was their first published game. It's a pretty blatant R-Type clone, but at least it has a really trippy looking graphics. DMA of course went on to develop such huge hits as Lemmings and the Grand Theft Auto series, eventually being purchased by Rockstar, having their name changed to Rockstar North. And yeah, this is pretty typical bio-horror here. You're being attacked by sperm. Oh god, what's this? Savage, developed by Probe, who were responsible for tons of computer game conversions, and later were sucked up by Acclaim. They ended up porting lots of games to the Genesis and other consoles. It was published by Firebird in the UK and Microprose, of all people, in the United States. This sort of thing was considered hot shit in the world of Commodore 64 games in 1988, as amazing as that seems today. A bit more interesting is Captain Blood, with music by New Age superstar Jean-Michel Jarre, though it really seems they just licensed a track from one of his albums. Published by the French company Infogrames, who later bought Atari, Captain Blood is not a pirate game, but a weird sci-fi game with some super trippy visuals, and lots of speech samples in some alien language. And apparently these 3D style landscapes were created using fractals, so this seems pretty cutting edge. One thing I haven't really discussed yet is ports of games for other systems. Remember that many big arcade hits came out for computers, often in really terrible versions, like the Commodore 64 Contra. And the absolutely horrible controls actually make it harder than other versions. That's fun. Or R-Type. The guys responsible for this conversion really screwed up the music. Amiga conversions were generally pretty good, and the Japanese Sharp 68000 had really good versions of arcade games. But almost anything else you saw on other computers at this time was generally pretty awful. The late 80s was a time of much transition in the world of computer games, as old genres began mutating or dying out, and new genres emerged. As technology improved and competition from the consoles increased, new ideas emerged. Some succeeded and some failed. One idea that took off in a huge way was sports games, which licensed the name of popular athletes or athletic associations. Electronic Arts was rapidly becoming the dominant figure in sports games via licensing, but other companies, such as EA's Bay Area neighbors, Accolade, also got in on the act. Jack Nicklaus's Greatest 18 Holes of Major Championship Golf was the first Jack Nicklaus golf game. Damn, that's some suntan, Jack. Mechanically speaking, this worked much like all the other console golf games we've been seeing with a power meter, except it has a lot more options. Developed by the Utah-based company Sculptured Software, the game received many sequels, becoming one of Accolade's flagship series. Though of course the granddaddy of licensed sports games was EA's One-on-One Basketball game from 1983. In 1988, they released a sequel, Jordan vs. Bird 1-on-1, with Dr. J being replaced by Michael Jordan. It's a pretty simple half-court basketball game, but the updated graphics allow for some pretty impressive digitized imagery of Jordan and Bird on the title screen. And EA even went through all the trouble to create a whole bunch of unique spectators in the stands. It's not just a bunch of circles representing faces. This got ported to a few consoles, but without the Nike logo in the background. But 1-on-1 is small beans compared to this game, John Madden Football, one of the cornerstones of EA's empire. By far the most sophisticated football game created at this point. Practically every aspect was customizable, even down to the weather conditions. The game had considerable input from Madden himself, and took around 4 years to make. EA hired Bethesda, later of Elder Scrolls fame, to work on it, based on Bethesda's football game Gridiron. Oddly, the first version was for the Apple II, but this here is a DOS release. Of course, not all ideas work out so well. Cinemaware was developing an idea for interactive movie games, one of the earliest being The Three Stooges. And granted, The Three Stooges looks nice, but when you play it, you see it's a slow-moving board game with lots of dull mini-games thrown in. Cinemaware was previously known for the great Defender of the Throne game, but they started moving in the direction of less interactive games, eventually going into FMV games. Three Stooges doesn't seem that interesting today, but it got a lot of press in magazines like Computer Gaming World, and was seen as a top-tier title and sort of a step towards the future of gaming. Speaking of dull games, we have another great-looking Amiga game this time from Melbourne House, aka Beam Software, who had previously released The Hobbit, perhaps the best-selling computer adventure game of all time, excepting maybe Myst. Melbourne House and Beam product is very hit and miss, and with The War in Middle-earth, they seem to aim for an odd combination of adventure game, RPG, and military strategy game. It didn't really pan out, and we were left with probably the only strategy game that's padded out with lots and lots of scenes of people walking down the road before you can get to any actual battles. Infocom, as seen earlier, were on their last legs by 1988. They tried to branch out from text adventures to something else called Infocomics, sort of a simple choose-your-own-adventure type electronic comic books. Only a few Infocomics games were actually released, including this one, Lane Mastodon vs. the Blubbermen, which is actually a Leather Goddesses of Phobos spinoff. The game seems to consider itself some sort of revolutionary new form of media, the big innovation being that you can switch the character you are following at certain pre-selected points. This branching paths in the storyline is the only hint of interactivity. But the stories and art are just too dull to make an impression, and these were designed by Tom Snyder Productions, who's actually still around today as a big producer of educational software. I'd say this is probably as close as Western game design ever got to the sort of style of like Japanese visual novels. One innovation that did end up taking off in the biggest way possible was more technological. 1988 was a major turning point for 3D games. We already saw how there were a few polygon-based 3D racing games that hit arcades in 1988, and we saw a couple early 3D titles in the 1987 Computer Game Roundup. But now we really see the concept taking off with games like Carrier Command from Real-Time Games Software. It's technically used wireframe graphics, and it's a weird battleship simulation / strategy game, but the 3D objects and environments were extremely impressive at its time. Another British 3D specialist was the horribly named Incentive Software. Darkside, which was sort of the sequel to their earlier game Driller, used the cutting-edge first-person 3D game engine Freescape, which allowed for the creation of 3D environments which you could move through freely. I guess you might call this sort of like a very early first-person shooter. Incentive followed this up with Total Eclipse, which was an Egyptian-themed game. And sure, this doesn't really look like much today, but it was pretty unbelievable back in 1988, even though it runs at like 5 frames per second. Still, you could sense the change was in the air. Once games could do this, there was really no turning back. A bit more fascinating is this game, Star Glider 2, developed by Argonaut Games. The first Starglider game used old-fashioned vector graphics, but the sequel introduced flat-shaded polygons. It's a basic fly-around-and-shoot-stuff game. Wildly praised upon release, I find the controls awkward, but it's still pretty impressive looking. As for Argonaut, they ended up working for Nintendo and helped design the Super FX chip, used in Star Fox and other games, before later moving on to create various crappy license games like Catwoman: The Game. Perhaps the most well-remembered of these early 3D games was The Colony, originally for the Macintosh. It's one of those games that involves running around an almost empty spaceship. It drew a lot of attention for a Mac game, and was later ported to other systems, such as this full-color Amiga version. And while the mouse controls are sort of clunky, The Colony definitely does have the cleanest looking real-time 3D environments we've seen so far. It was published by Mindscape, who also published Infocom's Mac Venture games, and nowadays release a lot of crap. Of course, all of these games are obscure and forgotten compared to this one. Tetris reached US shores in 1988, apparently debuting at the 1988 Consumer Electronics Show, though other sources say it was released in 87 or even 86. Either way, we'll definitely encounter Tetris and Crontendo again in the context of the spectacular Tengen vs. Nintendo battle over the game. One thing I can say about this version of the strange control scheme will really throw you for a loop if you're used to playing it on the D-pad. Aside from adventure games, if there's one computer game genre of this era that people still remember today, it's the role-playing game. 1988 is smack dab in the middle of the golden age of RPGs, and the year produced many memorable titles. The most anticipated game of the year was undoubtedly Ultima 5. It had been 3 years since the groundbreaking Ultima 4 was released, so fans of the series were definitely very anxious to see what Richard Garriott was going to offer up next. Ultima 5 was huge, 8 discs, and included this lengthy introduction. It was an ambitious game with heavy themes, much like Ultima 4. In fact, it's technically a sequel to Ultima 4, and clearly uses the same engine, more or less. It's somewhat surprising that Origin was still developing these things for the Apple II. While the game is a huge, vast epic, the mechanics seem sort of old-fashioned and even clunky at times. You still have the classic Ultima 3 style battles, and you have to pick up every single piece of treasures separately after winning a battle. After this game, the series was modernized a bit, with Ultima 6 getting a huge upgrade to DOS. Another big sequel was New World's Might and Magic 2, Might and Magic Book 2, the sequel to the 1985 game. Might and Magic was a pretty advanced RPG full of lots of NPCs and side quests. The sequel has much improved graphics. Here we are, rolling the die. That's hardcore. This is very much Dungeons & Dragons inspired, with tons of character creation options, complicated controls, big dungeons, a huge open world, and a general vagueness about what exactly you're supposed to be doing. Battles are in the first-person viewpoint, and they're turn-based. Wait a second, what are sewer rats doing in a forest anyway? Battles can be brutal and unfair, and you can, in theory, face up to 255 enemies at once. Like, look at this. 250 of these things? 1988 saw lots of sequels, such as Wizardry 5, which was still very old-fashioned, but finally introduced color graphics, or Bard's Tale 3 from Interplay. Some new faces did appear, however, such as Mars Saga, the first game from Westwood Studios, who later went on to produce Eye of the Beholder, Dune, and the Command & Conquer games. It's a pretty typical RPG with first-person mazes and random battles fought on top-down action segments. Perhaps more ambitious was Westwood's Battletech, the Crescent Hawk's Inception, published by Infocom. And dig that awesome PC music. This was based on a series of non-computer games, and was probably a lot more complicated than Mars Saga. This also had a top-down overworld, almost like a Nintendo game, and involved mechs. It almost sort of resembles a very primitive version of Xenogears. However, there are two RPGs that are probably the best remembered today. First off is Wasteland from Interplay, published by Electronic Arts. This post-apocalyptic game used a top-down overworld and turn-based battles, pretty standard, but Wasteland was perhaps the first RPG to use skill points, which you could assign to various abilities. This is of course commonly found in many RPGs today, and Wasteland served as the inspiration for an even more successful RPG from Interplay called Fallout. And of course we finished with one of the most beloved computer games of the era, Pool of Radiance from SSI, which stood apart from the crowd by being an official advanced Dungeons & Dragons computer RPG. Yep, rather than just being inspired by Dungeons & Dragons, this was a real Dungeons & Dragons game. Specifically a Forgotten Realms based game. Hopefully someone out there geekier than I can explain what exactly that means. Your characters are highly customizable, and you can even change their appearance on the battlefield, something I neglected to do unfortunately. The plot is basically rid the kingdom of evil. The story is simple compared to something like Ultima 5, but the SSI Gold Box games became sort of like the definitive examples of 1980s computer RPGs. And we'll eventually see a Nintendo version later in Crontendo. So there we have it. The good, the bad, the classic, the forgotten. Hopefully this little 1988 computer game roundup helps everyone just see how strange and wild and varied the computer game scene was at this time. So anyway, now let's get back to the Famicom. Let's start by stating the obvious here. Hanjuku Hero has some pretty good music. Yeah, that's our homeboy, Nobuo Uematsu, providing the soundtrack. When the game starts up, you have options of 3 campaigns. Hanjuku Hero, or Soft Boiled Hero, is one of the games from the time period where Square was transitioning to releasing Final Fantasy-themed games exclusively, at least in Japan. And even this one is clearly Final Fantasy inspired, and like so many other Square games of the period, has an alliterative title. Hell, even the overworld looks like it's taken straight out of Final Fantasy. Yet, Hanjuku Hero is more of a prototypical strategy RPG. These are all enemy castles, and you see enemy troops walking around on the overworld. Here's your castle. Inside you'll find the main character, Lord Almamoon, and what I presume are 2 generals of some sort, Zeus and Venus. Nothing like mixing up Greek and Roman mythology. You select the character you want to move, and then where you want to travel to, an enemy castle perhaps. Then the troops walk very, very slowly to their destination. I guess this is the real-time part in real-time strategy. Often you'll encounter these events where another character or characters appear. As you may have gathered by these sequences, Hanjuku Hero is a comedic, goofy game. The sequel, a Super Famicom game, even parodies Final Fantasy characters. Among other things, these sequences are where you can spend gold and recruit better units. Other times you'll have little gambling mini-games. Oh yeah, and the characters always walk in a straight line, so you'll swim across the ocean rather than using the nearby bridge. When you reach a castle with enemy units, a battle will occur. Now, there's really not much here in terms of tactical combat. The 2 sides just pound each other until one wins. No player inputs required for this kind of battle. Now, this game is described as an early real-time strategy game, which it sort of is, I suppose. It might be inspired by a computer game that came out earlier in the year called Herzog. Its sequel, Herzog 2, is somewhat well known in the West, but the first game was sort of the grandfather of the Japanese real-time strategy game. Hanjuku Hero has some of the same ideas, like buying units rather than building them, and even uses the same red and blue color scheme for the 2 different sides. But the Hanjuku series' most notable element is the egg monsters. There are a couple special attacks that can be used in battle, including hatching an egg monster. Your guys do a little dance around the egg, and then it hatches into a suspiciously full-grown monster, which more often than not can whoop the shit out of the other side. And I assume this was the inspiration for summons in the later Final Fantasy games. According to Wikipedia, the series was created by Takeshi Takeda, later known as the designer for Final Fantasy IV and the co-director for Chrono Trigger, but it appears that he was actually only a part-time employee at Square at this time, and only did the graphics. The actual director was Kazuhiko Aoki, an early Square employee, and the programming was outsourced to Bits Laboratory. Takeshi Takeda later became the main creative force behind the series, but apparently he did not actually create this game. So it's an interesting, but rather simple strategy RPG-ist type game, one that seems pretty simple. Still, it's definitely a switch from the typical strategy games we've been seeing lately. Hey, it's your old buddies Hudson. It never ceases to surprise me that Hudson still have the time and desire to crank out Famicom games, even as they are so focused on supporting the PC Engine. In late 1988, they were still the main producer of games for that platform. Ironic then that one of their most popular and longest lasting series started here on the Famicom. Momotaro Dentetsu is a train game. Remember that the Japanese have a thing for 1. Board games, and 2. Trains. The two were combined in 1985 with Take the A-Train from Art Inc., and Momotaro Dentetsu continues in this fine tradition. It works sort of like Monopoly. You roll dice and move your trains around and try to make money. Now you might be saying, wait a minute, the name Momotaro Dentetsu sounds very familiar. Well, what you're remembering is this game, Momotaro Densetsu, which was out about a year earlier. It's a straightforward Dragon Quest style RPG from Hudson, and Momotaro Dentetsu is a nutty takeoff on the original title. And of course, Momotaro Densetsu is based on the legend of Momotaro, the legendary Japanese folk hero who was born out of a peach. Momotaro Densetsu means Legend of Momotaro, whereas Momotaro Dentetsu means Momotaro's Electric Railway. One striking thing, however, is just how little Momotaro himself actually seems to appear in the game. On a purely visual level, this doesn't really look any different from any of the earlier train games, like Tetsudo-O, which we covered back in Crontendo 26. Mostly it's just you moving your train around, trying to make lots of money as far as I can tell. Though you get to also move via a ship at times. Hudson released various sequels every so often, and the series did take off, and there's a good 20 games for various consoles so far, with the series more or less moving to portable platforms in the more recent years. It became one of Hudson's major properties, along with Bomberman and Tengai Makyo. There are even tie-ins with actual Japanese railway lines. And the cool thing is, the series is still handled by Akira Sakuma, the original creator. So while this game doesn't really look like much, it would eventually blossom into a very popular series. Alright, we're 1 week into the middle of December 1988 and smack in the middle of the Japanese holiday shopping season. So the releases are coming pretty fast and furious. The last 6 games this episode all came out on the same day, December 9th. First up is the strangely named King of Kings from Namco. This is of course no relation to the unlicensed Color Dreams game, King of Kings, and the title doesn't really make too much sense. One thing about King of Kings, it's actually pretty interesting because it's like a fantasy-themed military simulation game. I wouldn't call it like a strategy RPG or anything, but it does seem kind of like a distant ancestor to games like Fire Emblem. For the moment though, let's call it Daisenyaku with elves. I'm in the campaign mode here. That fellow is the king, and he's the only one who can produce more units, as long as he's in the castle. We'll start by making a fighter, FIT. It's a standard human unit. Each unit costs a set number of funds. The more towns you conquer, the more resources you get. So it really works, I guess, a lot like Daisenyaku or Famicom Wars. One thing that's kind of unusual though is that the world map is set on an open field, like RPG style, as opposed to the distinctly marked squares in most of these games. One new thing though, the king can make multiple units per turn, whereas in games like Famicom Wars, each base can only make one unit at a time. Now aside from people, you need to make non-human or magic creatures, like harpies, who can travel further and are pretty damaging against humans. They're armed with little tridents or pitchforks or something. Just like these similar games, terrain will factor into battles, which are carried out in like quick little cutscenes, just like Famicom Wars. And the stats are actually pretty helpful and detailed. Now one thing, King of Kings was developed by none other than Atlus, just like Megami Tensei, also for Namco. And overall it's a pretty well made game. And there are some interesting similarities with Atlus's other work. For example, your opponent in the campaign is in fact Lucifer, and the fact that you can enlist things like harpies, goblins, dragons, and golems does give it kind of like a Megaton feel. One nice little touch is you can pull up a list of all your units with a single button press, and it'll show you which ones have moved. You can then select an unmoved unit, and it'll take you back to the map with that particular unit selected, a very convenient way to manage your units as opposed to somebody moving the D-pad all over the place. In later levels, all kinds of different units and creatures are introduced. There are also 8 multiplayer maps for up to 4 players. Bottom line, King of Kings is a highly original and better than average military strategy game. And now we have Godzilla, Monster of Monsters, which is one really stupid subtitle. We're going to switch things up a bit here, first by showing you the lame intro to the US version. Pretty catchy music though. And now compare this to the intro to the original Japanese game. Yep, this game was designed by Compile. It's like the credits to a Woody Allen movie. So dramatic. Whoa, it's like a way awesomer title screen. The Japanese always have cooler title screens, and the music is completely different too. This just says Godzilla, or rather Gojira, but the box art says Godzilla King of Monsters, which makes more sense than Monster of Monsters. So, back to the US version. Here's the animated intro that spells out the plot. It takes place in the year 2XXX. Wow, they couldn't narrow it down any further than 1,000 years? So the game takes place sometime between 2000 and 2999. And why does this text move so slowly? If you read this slowly, let's face it, you're basically illiterate. Well, here's the summary. Planet X, the bad guys from Godzilla vs. Monster Zero, invade the solar system and take over all the planets. Hey, how can King Ghidorah fly in space? His wings wouldn't work in a vacuum. So anyway, Earth sends Godzilla and Mothra to clean up the whole space invasion thing, one planet at a time. We start off on Earth. So I guess Earth has already been taken over because it certainly doesn't look anything like the Earth that we know. And so this is what, a military strategy game? It's got a hex-based map. But actually no, it isn't. Whereas King of Kings was a military tactics game that didn't visibly divide the map into squares or octagons or anything, Godzilla King of Monsters uses a military game layout for what is actually a beat-em-up. You select either Godzilla or Mothra and move them around on the board. You then get a side-scrolling segment where your selected monster moves across the map, beating up enemy monsters along the way. So you either select Godzilla or Mothra and then move around on the board. Once you make your selection, you'll get like a little side-scrolling segment where your selected monster moves across the screen, beating up enemy monsters along the way. But as far as beat-em-ups go, Godzilla is really weird. You see, your monster is huge, so big that it's impossible to avoid enemy attacks. You can jump and punch, but despite this, you are going to get hit a lot, at least when you're playing as Godzilla. The main objective on each world is to move both monsters one step at a time to the thing that looks like a radar dish. This will teleport you to the next planet. Now for each space you move, you'll have to pass through one short beat-em-up level. Godzilla can move 2 spaces per turn and Mothra 4. When using Mothra, the game becomes quite a bit different than when using Godzilla. It's almost like a shoot-em-up, if you can imagine a shoot-em-up using a really gigantic ship with a very limited range of motion. There's like an invisible line about 2/3 up the screen that you can't move any higher than. Mothra has these weird bombing attacks where he drops what they call poison quills. He does a lot less damage than Godzilla, and he can take less damage, but he has much better maneuverability. You'll often see other monsters hanging out on the main world map. If you end up on a square next to one, you'll fight a boss battle, like with Ghazorah here. The thing is, when playing as Mothra, you do so little damage it takes forever to wear down the boss's health, and because the battles are timed, it usually results in a draw. I guess each monster has its strengths and weaknesses. Godzilla is really powerful, but he can get overwhelmed if there are too many things on screen shooting him at once. Mothra can attack from above, which makes certain enemies, like these mushroom guys, much easier. Everyone seems to think that Godzilla is a much better character, but I actually died a couple times as Godzilla, but never as Mothra. It seems with Mothra you can just avoid more enemy attacks. These levels can be kind of difficult, or at least annoying, because it's really hard to see what's shooting at you. The enemies are always these little gun ports and cannons and things that blend right into the background, so you really can't see what's shooting at you. Okay, now we're moving on to Mars. You want to collect those red gems that occasionally pop out of enemies or rocks. They'll help restore your health. There's also a bit of an RPG element in here as well, as I'm sure you're not surprised. You will slowly level up as you progress through the game, getting longer life bars and a bit stronger. Godzilla's best weapon is the radioactive breath, useful for cleaning out a whole bunch of enemies at once, or against bosses. It drains your power meter, however, which refills very slowly. Here you can see just how easy it is to take out this guy using Godzilla, who gave Mothra quite a bit of trouble actually. Well, Godzilla is not a bad game, the graphics are good, but the gameplay is very unpolished. Your monsters are just so damn big and clunky. The levels are pretty repetitive, there's only a few different types, and the bosses are often just lame. Often they'll just stand there and let you wail on them while barely fighting back. It's a very original idea for a game, but it's hardly Compile's best. Ah, great, another FDS game. Tantei Jinguji Saburo, Kiken na Ninen, the third game in Data East Tantei Jinguji Saburo series. As before, developed by Sakata SAS. I'll be honest with you, this plethora of murder mystery type adventure games is really starting to wear on my nerves. How many more of these things can they release? Mystery-solving detectives were like the bald space marines of Japanese games in the second half of the 1980s, I guess. Once again, you control the oily-haired, hard-boiled detective Saburo. This one involves a motorcycle accident and a murder and switched-up identities. Naturally, Saburo cracks open the case by talking to a lot of people. It's interesting, the first Saburo game from 1987 was on the Famicom Disk System. Then there was a second, that was the Yokohama themed game that came out earlier in '88, but this second game got promoted to a cartridge. However now, number 3 is back on the FDS. And then Data East has the gall to rip off Nintendo's idea. You know how the Famicom Detective Club FDS game came out on 2 discs, and the game was divided in half, one on the first disc and the rest on the second disc, with the second being released about a month after the first? Data East does that exact same thing here. The second disc arrived in February. I guess this didn't catch on though, because the fourth game had just a regular cartridge release. By the way, if you want to play this game in English, you can. The first 3 Tantei Saburo games were reworked for the Nintendo DS, and came out in the United States under the name Jake Hunter Detective Files. Now, one historically noteworthy fact. The game was written by a fellow called Kazushika Nojima. He later moved on to Square and became one of the main writers for Final Fantasy, writing for numbers 7, 8, and 10, as well as the Kingdom Hearts games. This is his first writing credit that I'm aware of. Anyway, is this never-ending onslaught of adventure games ever going to cease? Probably not anytime soon. Nakajima Satoru, F1 Hero, the first game from racing game specialist Vari, though the game was co-developed by Human. And it's not a very pretty title screen, is it? I guess you are driving faster than a train? Kinda catchy music though. Nakajima Satoru was a real-life Japanese F1 racer, though not really a particularly good one. He had a pretty short career. Apparently he'd only been racing since 1987. There are naturally a few different modes, all of which we've seen before. Warm-up is the standard option where you play in one race. You can choose the track and car. The tracks are all based on real tracks, it seems. The names of the racers and the cars have all been changed a bit. So you have cars like Ferrari. Nakajima will give you tips on the particular course that you're racing. There have been tons of F1 racing games for the Famicom, or at least it feels like there have been. They never get released in the US, except this one did as Michael Andretti's Grand Prix. Michael Andretti is the son of Mario Andretti, perhaps the most famous American race car driver ever. Ironically, Michael Andretti was not an F1 racer, he was an IndyCar racer. This version uses real car names, but slightly altered name for the racers themselves. So, here we go. Wow, this is one tiny car. Seriously, that's like the worst looking car sprite I've seen in a long time. In fact, this is graphically one of the worst looking 3D style racing games on the Famicom. I mean, Pole Position was better looking and that came out in 1982. Of course, everything is tiny because the map takes up half the screen. When playing as 2 players, the top half is used by the other player. Too bad they couldn't create like a separate graphical mode for single player. The Grand Prix mode has you racing a whole bunch of tracks, and each race is long, 5 laps in this case. It's pretty monotonous. The game is pretty typical in some regards. Like many racing games of the era, your tires get wear and tear and you have to replace them occasionally. You can see the meter for the tires in the lower right. There aren't any RPG elements like in some of the other racing games we've seen lately. There are also no other drivers on the course. You have 4 gears, but you start off in neutral, so you have to put the car in the first gear when you start, otherwise you won't go anywhere. In an attempt at realism, you need to take the corners really slowly, and there are some hairpin turns that are pretty tricky. Also tricky, the controls. The steering feels very digital somehow. Tapping left or right will change the angle by a certain number of degrees, but unlike most racing games, you don't hold down on the D-pad while turning. You just tap once, and then you tap the other way when you want to straighten out. The controls definitely take some getting used to, and it's really easy to spin out. The first time I played this, I thought, wow, this is like the worst racing game on the Famicom ever. But I guess it's not really that bad, but you probably won't like the controls, and it's sort of too monotonous. Some courses are literally like 9 or 10 laps, so this is probably not going to be your favorite NES racing game. We are nearing the end of yet another Crontendo, but what's this? Nankin no Adventure. Why, it's another Japanese adventure game. Hooray! The origin of this game are sort of mysterious. One of the names in the copyright is Nanking. So, Nanking is a real person? Apparently so. He's a comic artist, though unlike every other Japanese manga artist in the universe, I couldn't find much about him online. This is one of the comic series he worked on. He seems to have sort of a weird, cutesy style, not the typical manga stuff. The game, however, seems like every other such game. You have such commands as look, inventory, and talk in the menu. Naturally, you spend a lot of time looking at everything and talking, until a new menu option finally opens up. I think I've said this before, but you could write a very simple computer program to play these games. You just need to go through the menus trying every single option until new options appear. Once new options stop appearing, maybe move to another location, then try again. No actual human intelligence is required to play these games. Nanki no Adventure appears to be one of those deliberately wacky games that pokes fun at Japanese culture. Beyond that, I'm really not sure what it's about, but really, at this point, who cares? Okay, here's the big game this episode, Tecmo's Ninja Ryukenden. Of course, you and I know this game from its 1989 NES release as Ninja Gaiden. It's remembered today for two things. First of all, there was this sort of thing. That's right, the superbly presented cinematic cutscenes. Sure, lots of games back then had fancy animated intros or little bits of story between levels, but Tecmo went all out, sticking in lengthy animated cutscenes between each of the game's acts, or levels, that were full of dialogue and moved the plot along. And the story was surprisingly ambitious for an action platformer. Each cutscene is tied directly into the levels that surround it. The intro shows our hero, Ryu Hayabusa, heading to the US to solve the mystery of his father's death. Then level 1 begins with Ryu on the streets of some major American city being attacked by goons. The rest of the game carries on in this fashion. There's action, cutscene, action, cutscene. We recently saw a bit from the arcade game Ninja Gaiden, a wacky beat-em-up that's completely summarized by the animated intro which declares Ninja in the USA, and that's exactly what it is. Ryu goes on a rampage to various US locations beating up goons. Much like Tecmo's Rygar, the home version is a completely different game. The arcade game was developed by someone named Strong Shima, whereas the Famicom game was by Hideo Yoshizawa, who later made some pretty cool games at Namco. The two games were created simultaneously but independently, and as a result are completely different in just about every way. The Japanese name means Ninja Dragon Sword Legend, but was given the easier, but still exotic sounding name of Ninja Gaiden in the US, or Ninja Gaiden as you may have called it, which is completely unfair. I mean, Ryu isn't gay. Sure, he has no time for girls, but that's just because he's a cold-blooded ninja who has no time for touchy-feely stuff, and oh, okay. Well, I guess he's just into the rugged outdoors type is all. So anyway, the second thing Ninja Gaiden is remembered for is the insane difficulty. This game is hard. And why are the power-ups in this level obtained from giant mosquitoes? And why are you being attacked by linebackers? Oh yeah, and let's not forget that enemies instantly respawn over and over and over again. In a situation like this, there's zero room for error. Thank God for the fire wheel. It gives you invincibility, but appears very rarely in this game. Each level has a boss at the end, and these greatly vary in difficulty. The first two guys are pretty simple, but some of the later ones can be pretty darn hard. Now each of the 6 levels has a completely different setting and is a bit harder than the one before. Difficulty ramps up from level 2 being sorta tough to level 6 being virtually impossible. And let's not forget such hated enemies as the Eagles. Just like those Castlevania Medusa heads, they are hard to hit, but if you don't kill them, they'll turn around and follow you and keep attacking you from behind. And there are almost always multiple types of enemies attacking you at the same time. The game conspires to constantly wear down your health. One thing I've noticed about Ryu is he's not a very good ninja. Aside from getting killed by birds and football players, it's pretty easy to get the drop on him. Just casually pull out a gun and shoot him. And once Ryu gets the all-important MacGuffin demon statue, some guy just waltzes in, grabs the statue, jumps up to the skylight, gives a little speech, while Ryu just stands there with his mouth hanging open. What the? Aren't ninjas supposed to be quick on their feet? Eventually, Ryu climbs a mountain and makes his way to the main bad guy's lair in the most well-known cutscene from the game. Certainly one of the most spectacular moments in the NES library. Then the plot thickens, the girl is kidnapped, the main bad guy appears. Oh yeah, also the CIA are involved, and then naturally Ryu gets dropped out a trap door. Apparently absolutely everything takes Ryu by surprise in this game. The final level is just pure unadulterated evil. The developers really want you to die over and over again. Enemies stand on teeny tiny platforms over huge pits, while flying ninjas dive bomb you. They really like to work out the timing so that when you get hit once, you will freeze for a second and fall back, and then take a second unavoidable hit. And come on, look at this here. I mean, 2 flying enemies attacking you at the same time? Or 2 flying enemies and a guy throwing projectiles at you? Why, Tecmo, why? I mean, thankfully you have a secondary weapon system taken straight out of Castlevania, but even so you always feel like you're outgunned. At some parts of the last level, you're like a pinball getting tossed around by the bumpers. It's just ridiculous. And all this raises the question, is Ninja Gaiden actually a great game? I mean, sure, the production values are great, but is the game just too unfair to be enjoyable? I mean, the developers really do rely a lot on repeated cheap deaths. Are they just padding the game? The level design isn't very inspired and relies a bit too much on the old platforms over pit setup. This certainly lacks the creativity of, say, Bionic Commando or Mega Man. And it's a shame because parts of Ninja Gaiden are very fun, and the game is certainly very visually striking in spots. There's an end-of-game plot twist which naturally takes Ryu completely by surprise. You see, his father isn't dead, just brainwashed by the bad guys. And then comes the fun part, a 3-part boss rush. And dying will take you all the way back to the beginning of level 6, thus cranking up Ninja Gaiden to the Ghosts and Goblins levels of frustration. The bosses are all pretty tough, but they're mostly just a matter of finding the right attack pattern. Thankfully, Tecmo saw fit to refill your life bar all the way at the beginning of each battle, but your special weapon ammo depletes after beating a boss. So the first boss is your father, and then of course he makes a brave sacrifice to save Ryu, proving that an old dying guy is faster than Ryu. The main bad guy is the Hakio, which I think is a made-up Spanish word, or maybe it's supposed to be pronounced Jackie O, which is utterly stupid. Can't name your video game bad guy after the First Lady. And he's really quite easy if you can get into the pattern of avoiding his fireballs, but if you mess up and get hit, it's sort of hard to get back into the pattern. Once he's killed, Ryu pretends to be in love with the big-haired chick, despite the fact that the only words he's ever spoken to her so far were, "Hey, it's a girl, get out of here." And then, taking his incredible slowness to a whole new level, Ryu proves he can't outrun a freaking lunar eclipse. And then he must face the new final boss. There's a bit of luck with this guy because he's sort of these little swirly things he shoots out will take out a huge chunk of your life bar, but they hit you, and they get fired sort of like in a random pattern. So sometimes you get hit a whole bunch of times, other times just they hardly hit you at all. After you've taken care of this guy, it's the father's death scene number 3, and then the bad guy's base blows up, Konami style. So, Ninja Gaiden, what do we think? Well, the cutscenes are impressive and give the game a cinematic scope beyond any similar games of this era. And the game design is sort of weird and filled with nonsensical enemies, like the football players. The difficulty ranges from challenging but good to stupidly difficult and cheap. On the other hand, the boss battles are all very cool looking and mostly well thought out. Of course, Ryu himself is the lamest ninja ever. Is he even a real ninja, or did he just steal like one of his dad's old outfits? All in all, this is pretty good, but the game could stand to be refined and tweaked a little bit, which is exactly what happened with Ninja Gaiden 2. But despite its flaws, it's still a landmark title for the Famicom and Nintendo Entertainment System. Alright, so what can we expect for the remainder of 1988? Sequels, that's what. Sequels to big-name games from Konami, Capcom, and Square. Also plenty of US-only games for the Christmas season, and another family trainer game. But you know what? Only a couple more episodes to go, and then it's 1989.